Hi, I'm Sarah Solis, Director of SAR Press, and I want to welcome all of you to our virtual book talk series. Today, we're joined by Steven Feld, Amahl Bishara, and Kristina Lyons, who will be helping me to celebrate the 25th anniversary of Senses of Place, which was originally published in 1996 as part of our Advanced Seminar series. In the book, co-editors Steven Feld and Keith Basso argued that place is the most fundamental form of embodied experience, the site of a powerful fusion of self, space, and time. Although the idea of place or any given place may seem simple and uncomplicated, our thoughts, feelings, experiences, memories, and politics attest to their complexity. Yet when this book was published, place and its profound effects on human life were rarely studied by cultural anthropologists. Feld, Basso, and their collaborators were among those who changed the conversation in anthropology, and this book showed what we could learn from the study of local perceptions and expressions of place. Rather than focus on representation and power, as some of their colleagues were doing, Feld and Basso chose to emphasize ethnographic, linguistic, and experiential writing. Since then, the field has expanded into studies of displacement, refugees, and exiles, studies of cosmopolitanism, and feminist studies of science, environment, and interspecies relationships, especially in relation to Indigenous placemaking and ecological knowledge production, perspectives that are represented by today's panelists. As we talk, I want to remind all of you in the audience to type your questions into the Q&A, and I'll share them as we go. So before we jump into the conversation, I'm going to ask our panelists to briefly introduce themselves and maybe say a few words about how they understand their work in relation to the idea or study of place. So Steve, would you go first?
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you for organizing this event. I'm really grateful and honored to be able to be talking with Kristina and Amal, but also talking about how the volume in the Advanced Seminar series continues to cross many conversations with many colleagues and friends. And so I'm an anthropologist, but I principally work in areas of language and sound and visual expression. And I have long had an interest in the senses and in memory. And like Keith, who was a colleague and friend of many, many years, I was also pushed into the study of place very much ethnographically because it was so foundational in the world of the Bosavi people in Papua New Guinea, where I worked principally from the mid-1970s to the millennium. And that was the basis of a long conversation with Keith, whose work with the Apache took a turn into the importance of place and something that he developed over the course of a number of essays. And so in 1990, when in fact I was a resident scholar at SAR, Keith and I began a conversation about the idea of an advanced seminar. And in 1991, we proposed this to Doug Schwartz, who was extraordinarily enthusiastic, and we were so grateful for Doug's enthusiasm. In fact, by the time we got the second version of the proposal onto Doug's desk, he called me on the phone laughing and said, "It's already done. I've spoken to the Wenner-Gren Foundation and they're in." So we really had the very generous support of SAR, Doug, and the Wenner-Gren Foundation in order to do this project. And the topic of place continued as a conversational point between Keith and I and many other people, but certainly with Keith until his passing. And for today's event, I'm very sorry that Keith is not here to speak, but his work speaks volumes, of course, as does the work of Nancy Munn, and who are not here with us now. I just as a final thing here, Sarah, I wanted to thank the SAR Press. This volume received extraordinary support from the press in its production, and Kate O'Donnell and Jane Kep did a fantastic job with the book. And I particularly am grateful to Kate, who, after many conversations about what we should put on the cover of the book, actually was the one who contacted Carol Anthony and got this wonderful painting that sourced that from Carol, which gave the book such a distinctive cover, one of my favorite covers of any project I've ever done. So I remain grateful for that as well.
I love that story. Thanks for sharing that. Amal, would you introduce yourself?
Hi. Yes, thank you so much, Sarah, for inviting me to be a part of this conversation, and Steve and Kristina. It's really wonderful to be in conversation. So I'm an anthropologist at Tufts University, and my field work revolves around the politics of expression for Palestinians. And I work in the West Bank and in Israel. And I was also very, very fortunate to be able to be a student of Steve's when I was a grad student. And so this volume has sort of traveled with me many, many places. I found in it a visa card, as in like when I went to the field, these little visa cards you get. So, it's just been back and forth and around the world. So it's been a great traveling partner, as well as a real touchstone for rich ethnography that takes its time to tell, such rich stories about places and people. And here I am now. So my first book was about the production of US news about Palestinian journalists and with Palestinian journalists through the second Palestinian Intifada. So I did that field work in 2003 to 2005 primarily. And now I'm working on a second big project. And sometimes when I look at sort of the book abstract, I think, well, it was really all starting, from this book, because it really thinks about the way in which expression is grounded in the body and in place. Because I'm looking at the relationship between Palestinian expressivity for the 20% of Palestinians who are citizens of Israel versus the Palestinians in the occupied West Bank, who make up 80% of the population there. So thinking about embodied expression for these two different Palestinian groups and what keeps them from speaking together and conversing together and speaking as a unit. So so this book has really, taken me many, many journeys, intellectual and otherwise. And I also have done some children's book work collaboratively with kids in Ida refugee camp, and a little bit of documentary production. And really, I think that these themes around expression and place run straight through everything I've done. So it's great to be here thinking more about this today.
Thank you so much. And Kristina?
Hi, yes, also a big thank you for the invitation to be part of the conversation today. And I really appreciate having the opportunity to reconnect with them all after several years that we haven't seen each other, and Steve, who I recently met this academic year. And so I am assistant professor of anthropology and environmental humanities at the University of Pennsylvania. And my work has really been trying to understand the way that relations that both compose and decompose places. And I've done that thinking through human-soil relations in the Colombian Amazon in the context of the US-Colombia war on drugs, and also with scientists in Colombia, and thinking about the way that that changing relations to place really have to do with changing relationships to soil, and with soil as living bodies and things. And so I think that the themes of, thinking about the relationship between materiality and politics, materiality and poetics, the sensorial, the textured layers of places and territory, these things have been really inspirational to me in my long-term fieldwork. I've been doing fieldwork in the Andean Amazon and foothills of Colombia for 17 years, so I'm quite embedded in place in the ways that this book reflects the kind of long-term engagements with the ethnographic field site, but with interlocutors and with making relationships and alliances and collaborations in places, in specific places. And so, that was my first book, was really about the human-soil relations, and now I'm doing work supporting the transitional justice process in Colombia, looking at the way that territories are being treated as victims of armed conflict, which is a kind of different approach in criminal and environmental law, and really has to do with taking inspiration from indigenous and Afro-descendant and campesino understandings of their relations to territory, and how territories are also equally victimized and need reparations. And I think that that's another aspect that's quite present in this book, making sense of multiple ontologies or different kinds of relations, and how this has to do in this case of my new project with transitional justice frameworks. And so I'm really pleased to be here, and I think that we're going to have a really fun conversation today. So thank you.
Steve, as we were planning this event, you were talking about how important the multi-generational aspect of the original book project was. And I wonder if you could tell us why and how that influenced this event.
Yes, thanks. When Keith and I were originally talking about this, one of the first things we each said to each other is, we're going to come off as completely presumptuous and perhaps even ridiculous if we act as if we're inventing something for the first time, when in fact there are people who have been engaged with this in a number of ways, but maybe haven't quite brought things together and created a kind of focus around it and a theorization around it that could really stick and circulate and move in anthropology. And so it was important to first, Keith said, yeah, great, well, let's, I want to tap into the generation of the people who taught me and the people who are older than me, a previous intellectual generation, and what they stimulated in me. So the presence of Charles Frake and Clifford Geertz was, as senior scholars, was really profound. And then there was a generation, Keith's generation and generations both in between Keith's and Chuck and Cliff's and mine, and that included Karen Blue and Nancy Munn and Ed Casey. And then the people more of my generation, and that was myself and Mimi Khan. And then I had the good fortune to be able to hire Katie Stewart at the University of Texas for our Expressive Culture Center in the late 1980s. And she was working on place in Appalachia. And so a younger voice, a younger generation, a younger perspective came in there with Katie. So we really are kind of like four overlapping intellectual generations in conversation with each other. And for me, that was one of the most productive things about the advanced seminar, that we were able to do that. And which is also why I'm so grateful to be able to have representatives of two younger intellectual generations here. And I remember very strongly around the moment of this book and the moment of reading Amal's master's thesis at New York University about Palestinian homes in Jerusalem and the dispossession surrounding those homes and the senses of place around that, and the visual and the material and the tactile and all the sensory dimensions of history that Amal brought out in that project. And so I feel a strong connection with the kind of work that Amal has done, and work that a generation has taken the question of place much more into issues of dispossession and displacement and diaspora and processes of social differentiation, which derive from profound histories of conflict, and, as Cliff put it in the afterword of the book, too much history and too little geography, and it's also a strong connection because of interspecies work that I've done, and thinking with being really touched when I read Kristina's book, Vital Decomposition, and began to think about how much something that we completely didn't touch on in our book, or any of the perspectives there, really related to some of the physical dimensions of place and soil, and the way that connected indigenous ontologies and scientific worldviews and realms of conflict, and ideas about what, just the larger relationship of place to life and the life sciences, and how this opened a whole new set of dimensions. So, when Keith and I conceived this project, we knew about the project, the collectively edited book on place and the politics of identity. We knew about a book that was called Culture, Place, and Representation that was coming out. We were very aware of Akhil Gupta and Jim Ferguson's project, which resulted in a book right around the same time called Culture, Power, and Place. And we knew that a lot of people were focusing on place. And even though we were a little worried that people might think that we were being kind of politically aloof in a certain way in this volume, we felt it was really important to have long essays and concentrate in a lengthy way on a kind of ethnographic demonstration of just the profound depth of how place and personhood are entangled. And I should also just close this by saying that within the year after Senses of Place was published, Keith published his book, Wisdom Sits in Places, which is announced in Senses of Place by his chapter. And that book, of course, went on to have an extraordinary readership and to be, very lauded in many ways. And Katie Stewart went on to publish A Space on the Side of the Road, which became almost equally like Keith's book, an instant classic, not just in American studies, but in a kind of anthropological world of people thinking about voice and place. And Ed Casey, who gave us a fantastic philosophical essay on space and place for the book, came out with a book called The Fate of Place shortly after, which is a philosophical history of the concept of place, which is a really profound intervention that helped many people. And Keith and I wanted Ed to be part of this conference because we had both read his book, Remembering, which has a great chapter on place memory. And we knew of the extent to which he was also engaged, one of the few really, as a philosopher with anthropological and grounded ethnographic studies of place. So all that's a way of saying, yes, it was multi-generational, and it also was at a particular moment intellectually. I certainly don't want to, as Keith didn't, give any sense that we were trying to invent something. We really were part of something that was a larger intellectual trend, and we were happy to just try and mobilize as much of it as we could, and bring these generations and these perspectives into conversation, even though that we knew that there would be some fireworks between the kind of phenomenology of Ed Casey and the interpretivism and hermeneutics of Clifford Geertz. And, we knew there would be, perspectives that would, fit as well as ones that didn't fit. But the mixing of generations was really important. And that's why I'm so grateful to Amal and Kristina for helping bring this story into the present and how it has been significant for their intellectual generations.
Someone just asked if we can share some of the books that you all are talking about. Maybe in our follow-up somehow we could send people a list if they're interested. Yes. Amal, I was wondering, what are your thoughts about how the field has developed since the publication of the book? And I wonder if you and Kristina are able to give us any stories or examples from your own work that would illustrate, some of the ideas we're talking about and how they've changed over the last 25 years.
Well, so I think that idea about thinking about how a lot of the discussion around place was around representation and identity, but this volume moves things more towards phenomenology and experience, has been so important for me. Again, I mean, I work in a location where there's a lot of a lot of work on representations and a lot of thinking about, I don't want to not think about conflict and displacement, right? Obviously, this work takes you there in such an important way, right? but to be able to do it in a way that, truly like sits in some places, like really sits and enjoys and takes in what it means to be in a place is really important. And also to take seriously how people experience place. So I think one thing that I've seen in a lot of work about refugees, is to think about refugee connection to the camp spaces or sometimes the urban spaces, wherever they're living at that moment, as well as to their places of origin. I think that's a really important move in refugee studies in general that's come up in work of Lisa Malky, Diana Allen, and also I see it in my own field work, and to not let to really let different kinds of experiences of place sit together, even though it's really uncomfortable and difficult to do so. I mean, that's something that I think comes through in Katie Stewart's piece, for example. But thinking about, and I mean, I'm right now working on a piece on tear gas and skunk water in the refugee camp where I spend a lot of time. And these are really very census of place is very important because it makes you think about the central experience of these weapons that are designed to be non-lethal but make you feel really bad. So what does it mean to take in those sensory experiences and also to think about how people treasure and enjoy place, and I've been able to also, work with media makers in the community there who are, working with children, for example, who bring forward these incredible connections to community and to space that come up even in these really difficult circumstances. So I think that focus on experience was, for me, a huge anchor in allowing me to think deeply about the places that I've come to care about so much in my work. I mean, I have many, many examples, but there are other things we can come back to. So I'll pass it to Kristina. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, likewise, I think, the relationship of people to places, but the relationships that make and destroy places, and that people are of places, the kind of deep relationalities, as well as being ripped from place and territory and home. And these are obviously continue to be very salient and enduring and absolutely relevant issues, problems, situations, right, that we're faced with in the world, and in particular places and situated places. And I mean, in my own research, I mean, I do think that there's been a shift where maybe the framing isn't so much wisdom sits in places, but that wisdom is of places, and the more active kind of thinking about the multiple kinds of actors that are not only human actors, right, that make places and unmake places, or there's a decompose and compose life. And I think that's been some of the moves maybe in some of the new scholarship, thinking about materiality and immateriality, but about getting outside of modern binaries between subjects and objects, and all of this has to do with relations, right, that make what we may be calling places and territories. And I think definitely in my own research, this book really gives tools to open up what we understand as politics, right, outside of the ideological and really into the affective. And I think the book, especially, Katie Stewart's chapter and other of the chapters, really point to that affective turn that later becomes even more important, and thinking about everyday politics and micropolitics and the way that how vibrant relationalities and pulsations and energies and the sensorial aspect is what makes defends life as much as banners and protest and the political writ large, is the kind of representational politics that we're used to, and our more conventional politics. And I think that definitely was very important in my work with the farmers in the Colombian Amazon, where they were trying to mobilize was the life making, the vibrating energy, the resonating pulsations of their farms that would be contagious and would make other people want to have similar kinds of transformative, where they recolonize their farms with the selva that's behind me, right, versus taming and deforesting and working the land as such. And I think these are, this is all very much like hearkened to in the chapters of this book, and definitely come out in my research, and ever more now the other kinds of work that I'm working on. The real necessity of, people to be citizens, everyday folk, people to be participating in the territorial ordinance or the planning decisions, all the decisions that are made over their lives, right, that affect the places where they live. These are constitutional rights. I'm getting into some legal language, but it's more than that, right? It's not about the rights and rights violations. It's about the participation of people in all the decisions that have to do with where they live, and that will affect them, and that affect the well-being of all the life forms that they are part of, that we are part of as humans. And I'm ever more convinced that this kind of question of territorial ordinance, to call it, lack of a better terminology, right, like about those interventions in making of place and decision making over places, like the real space of defense of life, defense of territory. I mean, in the face of impunity, in the face of the ongoing, human rights violations and dispossession, and where can we find the spaces to defend life? And I think that that's really embedded in what Steven, the other colleagues in the book were trying to propose and give us tools to think with in different ways, right? As different scholarship has also, like the sciences and technology studies and political ontologies and other kinds of questions have become relevant in cultural anthropology in our interdisciplinary interfaces.
I was going to just
Sarah, can I just add something to that? Before we move on, I just wanted to say that listening to Amal and Kristina, it touches me that one of the things that was not ever said by an anthropologist, but was announced in Ed Casey's philosophical chapter in the book, but actually became the point around which everybody in this advanced seminar united the most and gave us the most liftoff, was Ed's sentence in the book where he says, places are equally psychical and physical. And he goes into a historical and philosophical discussion of that. And I think what Amal and Kristina are talking about there, really harken back to that, this idea that anthropology has this power in our relationships with our interlocutors and the communities of concern that we engage with over time. What ethnography really does is to articulate the powerful way in which place not only is equally psychical and physical, but becomes more and more so, particularly in situations of conflict, displacement, and other kinds of onslaughts of injustice and insults, against the sense of place that people have. And so I think that very much connects with these things that Amal and Kristina have brought up. And I would just say, as a little anecdote, I'm not a follower of Google Scholar or whatever that website is, but one of my students once writing a paper actually about wisdom sits in places in the last place course that I taught at University of New Mexico, after I took over the seminar that Keith initiated on that topic, put in a footnote that the single most quoted sentence that I've ever written is the sentence that says, as places are sensed, senses are placed. And which is another sort of light rephrasing or working around this powerful way that ethnography taps into the psychical and the physical nature of place simultaneously.
Amal, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to throw maybe one more theme into the mix here as we're getting started, which is mobility. Mobility comes up in Senses of Places, and Karen Blue's article and Steve's article, of course, in Keith Basso's work. And I think that thinking about, there's a lot of really rich literature emerging around mobility, and especially around driving. And driving, I think, walking and driving, and many forms of mobility, and that really bring together, again, sort of a sensed experience of place, and thinking about also certainly place as psychic and social and sensed. And also, in my own experience, for example, doing this multi-sided research between two places that are quite close to each other, and yet that require a lot of transportation. Finally, kind of for my second project, I ended up having to rent a car and doing a lot of driving across the green line that separates Israel and the West Bank. And I was the only one who could do the driving in my family group because I was the only one with the legal right to do that, right? So, and I don't really like driving. So, so there I was, but you have to just sort of own it, right? And, so I ended up with like a lot of notes about what it meant to back out of this, terrible parking spot where you have to like reverse quickly up a hill and then not hit the car that's right behind you. And then you spiral out through these narrow alleyways, and that's the refugee camp. And then eventually you're on these big bypass roads that were built with US money, for example, right? And then eventually you spiral back into, a village in the Galilee inside Israel, where once again, parking is a disaster, and I can write pages about, parking next to the dumpster on the side of the fence and hoping that the whole mountain doesn't collapse as I, back into it. So, but just this idea of thinking about mobility across multiple modalities. And I mean, I guess the other thing that I didn't kind of say there, which is that, of course, I started to enjoy the driving as well. So, the pleasure of driving that kind of, and the pleasure of mobility that gets kind of built into these experiences, and driving with people and talking with them about, particular intersections or how things have changed over time, has been a really, really rich practice for me. So field work is never about the destination. It's, well, I mean, it is about the destination, but it's also definitely about sort of the trip that you take to get there. So that this book definitely helped me alert me or make me sensitive to those possibilities.
I love that idea of taking pleasure in mobility. Steve, I wonder if you have anything to say about that from your work in Ghana, maybe, I don't know, taking pleasure in place and mobility and movement. And
yeah. I do, but before I do, I want to encourage everybody to read Amal's article called "Driving While Palestinian," because I think it's an absolute classic. It's a wonderful way in which topics of place and mobility and the whole way in which these psychic and physical dimensions of place take on a whole new kind of spin. Because what does it mean to constantly have to be crossing something or imagining crossing something, and what does it mean to be vulnerable when getting from point A to point B when you're doing that crossing, and when and you shouldn't be vulnerable because you are rooted in both of those places. So this was a very important article for me, and I've had the pleasure of doing a lot of work for the last 15 years in Ghana. And one of the projects that I've worked with is with a union of truck drivers who invented music for their squeeze bowl truck horns. In fact, they took the horns off their vehicles and sacralized them and invented a funerary music, which is only played at the funerals of truck drivers and transport workers, in parades and in a ritual that somewhat resembles the New Orleans jazz funeral. And people would say to me constantly, the driver's road must be paved with the honking of the horn. Just the way in New Orleans they say that the musician's road must be paved with the sounds of, those trumpets and the cries and the joyful voices. And so this idea that connects place and mobility, that mobility is somehow always inherent in our invocations of place. And what struck me so powerfully in Ghana was that the deepest pride of drivers was the sense that they opened the roads, and therefore they are the true pioneers of the country's history. So there's a huge working class pride, which I got involved in studying, which was, at the confluence of this honking horn music and truck driving and this mastery of mechanics and mastery of all kinds of skills of the road. And what struck me quite powerfully was that this was in some ways very little different from what I had studied in New Guinea for so many years, which is the way that singers and poets create songs that map their lands. And that in 1,000 songs that I recorded over 25 years, there were more than 7,000 place names. And everybody's biography and everybody's history was connected to these songs and the way they mapped the relations of families and persons and places and memories and so forth. And there was a very similar thing going on here with these, with the people who are very urban, very cosmopolitan, but very rooted in a working class national Ghanaian context as truck drivers. So, another kind of critique of things like senses of place, which developed in anthropology over the years, is, perhaps too much focus on the exotic and not a focus on the modern. And I've been able to, talk back to this through the kind of urban work that I do in Ghana and the work I've done with truck drivers. In that, as a last thing that I wanted to add to that, just as a sort of historical footnote to the book, Keith and I were both, well, myself as a Melanesianist at that point, but Keith more generally because he also had experience of both going to and thinking about and reading a lot about Aboriginal Australia. We were both blown away by all of the work of Nancy Munn, who was both a friend and a really good colleague and a deep and super sensitive reader and a great conference participant. And, when Keith and I asked Nancy to participate in the conference, she said, yeah, that's great, but I'm working on Central Park. And we both said, we both kind of blurted out at the same time, wonderful, we want to know about Central Park. Nancy, sent us a 200-page manuscript about Central Park. It was unbelievable. And then, we managed to get it to about 125 pages. There was no way, even with long essays in the book, that we could get it, that we could work with her to get it to a size. She was still just at a beginning moment with this extraordinary project. So I'm really sad to this day that some version of Nancy's essay didn't get into the book, because I think the story of Central Park and the story of the creation of multiple places within the idea of a place or something called a park, and the way this was meant to relate to the history of architecture, the history of the city, the history of the mobility of persons between the east and west side of the city, and all sorts of things. And the idea of something that would unify or bring people together in the city while at the same time making their parts of the city more and more distinct. This is, really relates to the modern world and to the history of the conflict of the building of around the building of New York City quite profoundly. So I'm just sorry we didn't get to include that in Senses of Place.
Kristina, when I think about soil, that kind of seems like the opposite of something that's mobile to me, but is there some way in which your work talks about mobility also?
I mean, I think what the soil, the way that I try to treat soil and its multiple kind of like ontologies is that soil is a relation, and it's a constant recycling relationship that can't be ruptured. So it's not an entity, it's not fixed, it's actually a relational movement between the litter layers that fall from the ground and the microbial ecology that decomposes that, and then what germinates out of that again. And that, so it was kind of like, I think that's what the soil teaches us so wonderfully, that there is no life and versus death. There's no geo versus bio. There's no inert versus, mobile, and that there's living and there's dying happening at the same time. And so I think that's the kind of movement that I'm, it's relational kind of, and the need to keep that movement, to keep that cycling, because anything that ruptures that is what causes degradation, what causes the deforestation, what causes these kind of violent cycles that eliminate the Amazon, the Amazonian forest, and impoverish people and perpetuate different kinds of violence and social environmental conflict. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, I mean, in my book and in the field work, I was able to move between the worlds scientific laboratories and soil science, surveys in the cities of Colombia, and then doing this very embedded work in rural areas of the Amazon, in ways that connected those worlds. I mean, they're implicitly connected because of the way that the policies and knowledge is produced, or the way that the scientific knowledge informs public policy that then moves out in the world and has deep impacts on people's lives in all, in far off places, right? Not from the centers of the supposed knowledge production. And so there was something challenging about that in the writing, when I was writing up, where I felt like sometimes those worlds seemed so, I couldn't figure out how to put them into conversation in the book. But finding articles by the scientists in the libraries or the homes of small farmers in the Amazon, finding these snippets, right? So I guess what I'm trying to say is that there's a lot more. I mean, what seemed like disconnections, or what seemed like there's a lot more movement that's happening, and that was really like the discovery of like what led me back into the cities was actually what I found in the countryside. So the disconnect wasn't there. I don't know if that makes sense. That answers your question, but those are the kind of ways that comes up in my work. Mm-hmm.
So speaking of bringing people together, we have a question from Elaine, who says, in New Mexico, the stage is set to launch the first commercial space flight. Place is expanding. Do you think moving off the planet will bring new bonding between the Earth's inhabitants? How might the expansion of our ideas about place create different relationships between the people who are still here?
I think inevitably this will happen. I mean, look, Clifford Geertz went to great lengths during the Census of Place conference to constantly say, okay, well, this is all really interesting, but hey, folks, 50% of the population of the world lives out of place. What does that say in the context of a book where, we're talking so much about rootedness and these incredible attachments that people have? And I think that was, also a kind of spark in this same kind of direction, to think about in place and out of place. And I remember that it was Amahl who actually alerted me to reading more of the writings of Edward Said, and in a sort of autobiographical piece, he talks about the necessity of living out of place in order to have certain kinds of understandings of the world, and how living out of place, he would defend, to the very end, the idea that of living out of place, and how beneficial it was, what it could actually bring to the conversation about the meaning of places. And I thought that was a very powerful phrasing that Said used in that book. I'm sure Amahl has more to say about that particularly in the Palestinian context. I'm also touched by how the idea of voyaging and the history of anthropology is comes in the form of a history of traveling. Levi-Strauss starts the Tristropique by saying, I hate travelers and I hate traveling, but here I am. I'm going to start telling you my story. And then all of a sudden, we're in the tropics. So anthropologists have a vexed relationship with travel and traveling, but we're the ones who often profit from it the most in terms of the way we get to reflect on and throw ourselves into these kinds of histories of what being in place and being out of place mean, and why this only reinforces our understanding of the profound capacity to inhabit or to be in the world. it's kind of like what Kristina was just saying before, which is really that the anthropology of place is an anthropology of life, and the study of soil, couldn't be a better example of that. The anthropology that basically says what is the life process, what is the life form. And I think going in, traveling into spaces asks the question, what is the human imaginary, and why do we continue to seek new place experiences? One of the famous geographers of place defined the experience of place as breathing out and breathing in, or analogized place to like breathing out and breathing in, and the human desire to move and to return. And I think that this, which I think is a strong bodily kind of idea of it, connects to mobility. It connects to literally the groundedness of soil, and the physical attachments that people have to the smells and the sounds and the feelings and the tactility of where they live. And why would movement, why would the experience of being without gravity, or moving to other places, and trying to understand what that tells us about life, why would it be any different?
Yeah, I love that, thinking about voyaging in that way. And I would be remiss right now if I don't mention the multiverse right now. My daughter may or may not be listening in from another room, but I mean, basically thinking about these sort of decentering notions of space, and how our understanding of the world, the solar system, the universe, and beyond has sort of led to this sort of decentering of our place in it. And I do think that, thinking about particularity of places is one thing that Senses of Place helps us to do, to really to think really seriously about that specificity. But, thinking more about sort of our whole universe structure and beyond the universe really opens up just a sense of wonder, I think, that can be so useful and rich. But I do think that when we think about space travel, we also have to stay grounded and think about, does space travel as it can happen today, reinscribe and re-empower capitalism and colonialism, even, our visions of the universe, if they're coming from vantages on indigenous land, how do we, address that, as the telescope on Mauna Kea in Hawaii, for example. So there's a lot of ways in which sort of the otherworldly connects to the politics that we're very familiar with. But I'll just throw in one more space reference because it ties so nicely to Kristina's work. There's a beautiful book called Stuff of Stars. And I will try to put it into the chat we eventually make. It's a children's book, and it's about the Big Bang to the birth of a child, because it's a children's book. But so it's really so much about the materiality of our universe and how we are made of the stuff of stars. So, that sort of, again, but breaking down that bio-geo division to think of sort of how we are made of the water and the horses and the dinosaurs and so on and so forth, and how we are connected to the otherworldly as well. So yeah.
Oh, I love that. Kristina, do you have anything to add about going into outer space?
I mean, I have to say that my kind of first reaction is a little less optimistic about I think I tend to ask myself, like, the kind of coloniality of that endeavor, and the escapism of that endeavor, and really so many dilemmas that we're trying to deal with in terms of climate change, but also just social environmental conflicts and degradation, and how we really haven't been able to figure things out here by any means. And then, does that actually ability for us to possibly go inhabit somewhere else allow us to continue to normalize or escape from the work of justice, inequality, and of healing and reparations, and of restoration, ecological and otherwise, right? That needs to happen on planet Earth, right? And about how, we need to rethink our energy policy. We need to be, reimagining our political economy, or, our food system, et cetera, all of the, what we know that are many struggles that are happening now, that's what my first reaction is is about possibly would that vantage point, as Amal said, provide different reflections for Earth inhabitants, and this kind of sensibility about the need to really to safeguard, protect, and recover Earth, as much as it is about possibilities to be living elsewhere or to be connecting with life elsewhere or about inhabiting other planets. And so, yeah, so if that's the case, then, and I think it obviously will be multiple, what the new possibilities, I mean, it's not going to be either one or the other, right? There are kinds of openings as much as there are foreclosures that will happen with the, commercial space flight as they become more and more, every day, maybe in a short period of time. So, so that's, yeah, but unfortunately, I think my response is a little more like worried about what that allows us to continue to not take responsibility for here and for whom we don't have to continue to take responsibility for here and in this planet. So anyways, yeah.
I'd like to bring that back to New Mexico for just a second, everybody. Maybe some of you are familiar with a wonderful film that starred David Bowie titled The Man That Fell to Earth. It's based on a science fiction novel by Walter Tevis. And it was filmed in New Mexico, and where David Bowie actually falls to Earth is in the mine shaft in Madrid, New Mexico, and the book is the book and the film are both profound warnings about the possibility of a reverse form of imperialism and capitalism. David Bowie, as the lead character in the film, very quickly manages to get the patents on thousands of different kinds of inventions and technologies because he brings these from another civilization to the Earth, and all of a sudden, becomes, the combination of everything you might not like about Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg and et cetera. And it's a very profound kind of reverse. It's a kind of reverse anthropology version of going into space. And it's also set here in New Mexico, and the scenery and the cinematography is absolutely compelling, very, very beautiful. Criterion released it in a director's cut edition.
I think it was you, Kristina, who said something about using your work or using your writing to take people there. And I love that idea. And I would like to hear from each of you about how you do that. How do you use your writing to, evoke places and try to help people understand what and where you're talking about? And, do you have to do something else besides writing at some point? Kristina, do you have any thoughts about that?
Sure, I can go first. Yeah, I think that there, especially, in senses of place, that there are similar methodologies and genres in that book, right, that we also are engaging with now, right, about that deeply sensorial and ethnographic writing and writing texture and writing intensity. And how do you do that? How do you do that on a Word document page? Or how do you keep all the pulsation and the multiple voices and the sounds and the write it in a written form? And that's a struggle, right? And I think, at least in my book, I tried to think about writing hojarasca, how to write as selva, not write, representing the selva or, romanticizing the selva, but trying to put in conversation. I think the ecological sciences, but the poetics and materiality and politics but how do you do that, right? And there are literary forms of writing, and I think in poetic forms of writing that provide us with tools, but also all, as you mentioned, right, beyond the written word, right? And I think that those are very important. Each project entails different methods and different genres because of the different publics that one is trying to engage with, or that one is engaging with, and the different problems require not only different conceptual tools, but also different genres. And that writing soil is not the same as writing watershed, and a writing forest is not the same as writing, a building. And I think that that lends itself to, how do we engage in performance? How do we do work that's audiovisual? How do we do, how are we using radio? When we work in places where there's no phone signal and people actually get most of their information through radio, community radio programming, and radio plays, and when it's necessary for, instead of a protest, to do a political performance where performing being fumigated by glyphosate, and what that looks like as a root that's dying, versus writing another communication to the presidential office saying, stop fumigating us, for instance, in the U.S. funding war on drugs. And these different strategies that I think multimodal work in anthropology and experimental ethnography, and that was, happening in census of places. There was already people engaging in that kind of writing in that book, right, have become even more important in the field of anthropology, and it's, as I say, multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary practice. And definitely that's very important in my work, doing, kind of engaged anthropology always, but thinking about the different publics and the different genres that are necessary to make worlds, to write worlds. And that's what we do as ethnographically, or at least that's what I understand what we do, right? Is that we are writing worlds. And that is literary as much as it's a social scientific and endeavor.
Amal?
Well, the answer to how to write about a place, my answer is very, very slowly. No, I'm just kidding. No, I'm joking. But no, it does, in my case, require a lot of returning back and opening up and letting text breathe. And then, of course, weeding out and pulling back to what really needs to be there. And I think, just thinking about particular places in the writing when for example, if I'm writing about a protest, how important is the specific city where it's happening? How important is the specific route? How important are the place names that are used in the Facebook announcement? And the language is involved, and so on and so forth. And then how important, so I've written about protests, for example, in Haifa. Haifa has a beautiful Baha'i temple on a mountain that becomes the backdrop for all these protests. And in some ways it seems like it seems outside of the frame of what people are, protesting about. But it's also so visually dominant and so beautiful. So, how do you work in and think about a detail like that? And for me, though I definitely feel like a writer much more than, much more than I am a photographer or a filmmaker, those practices of photography do help me to think about place, and the fact that you can't take a picture of the protest without the Baha'i temple, or if you do, it's a less interesting one, or you're choosing this rather than that. So really thinking about a place in a way that allows for the excess, right? And then that also kind of gets things pared back for that will, that the reader will be able to accommodate. And the other thing I think has been really important for me in my practice is to work collaboratively. So, for example, I worked with a group of youth on an alphabet book about this refugee camp. And so we had the kids brainstorm for each letter, something Arabic letter, what goes with that, with their community related to that letter. And then we collaboratively made a collage for each letter. And, so really getting to see the place through their eyes a little bit, and put that together as a text that we can all use to kind of present the community to others has been interesting. Or I have other work where, collaborating about sort of the are very different perspectives, like my perspective and my collaborators' perspective being pointedly and importantly different, and letting those differences come out and letting kind of the failure of a unison flourish, right? I mean, I think sort of the concept of lift up over sounding is so great because it doesn't prize or land on unity. It's all about texture and multivocality, and nationalism does not always lead, does not often lead to anything like lift up over sounding. But for me, both politically thinking really what liberation is, and for me as a writer and a creator, I always want to be thinking about bringing in more voices and more textures in a way that maybe resonates a little bit with that lift up over sounding logic or approach.
Steve?
Um, I'm very lucky in a strange way. Because I'm profoundly dyslexic, I was a very late reader and a very late writer. And so I learned to articulate ideas and understand ideas in visual materials and in sonic materials through music, through painting, through photography. In many ways before I learned to be articulate as a writer. One of the things that that's led to in my practice is that I've, published equally in sound and image and film and radio and photography and text over the course of my career. And I couldn't have met a more important place for a multi-medial practice than my experience in Bosavi in Papua New Guinea, where these songs, like the ones that I discuss in the Waterfalls of Song chapter of the book, move through the forest the way birds move through the forest, but also move through the forest the way memories move through the forest, and also move through forest the way people move through the forest. So you have to imagine these songs as having a component of the tactility of the feet, a component of the complete poetic imagination, and a component that actually relates to a kind of knowledge of the physical way that birds move through waterways in the forest. And in fact, instead of just poetically transcribing these songs, I first, after I recorded them and knew something about what they were, we had to go out and literally map them, walk them through the forest. And then, as I'm not a very good tree climber, and some of the places that you would have to swim through would be beyond my skill level, I got into doing Polaroid photography. And now, of course, 25, 30 years later, we have drone photography, we have all other kinds of things. So my readers were helped very much, and I was helped very much by the chapter I wrote for Senses of Place, because the CD already existed. The CD with those songs on them, and where you could hear not just the voice of the singer and the poetics of her song, but the waterfall and the waterway that she's singing with. And you could connect all of those places and begin to understand that. But 25 years later, with the technology available, I've turned that into a visual translation. Instead of using Polaroid photographs, we actually use both drone technology with the consultation and collaboration of local people to follow the paths of the birds, to follow the footpaths through the forest, and to also try to invoke by multiple collage imaging, photo montage, split and 2 ways, split 3 ways, screens with still pictures and moving pictures at the same time, to try and move into the deep imaginativeness and power of these songs in the Voices of the Rainforest film. So writing for me has always been something that is not singular. It goes along with, recording sound and doing dialogic editing and auditing to understand that. It goes along with publishing the sound. It goes along with publishing through photography as much as sound and text, and ultimately film. And most recently, as a senior scholar, it's through the great support of SAR that I was able to spend 4 years and work on the Voices of the Rainforest film in residence and publish an intermedial book, a book that has the CD, that has a Blu-ray disc, that has hundreds of photographs as well as text. And this is all about what Senses of Place was about. What does it mean to move closer in the translation attempt to worlds of place and sensorial worlds that will always remain far away and exotic in one sense, but really, can we test our capacity to get close and to take the intimacy that we understand as researchers who spend long times in places and engaged with interlocutors? Can we take that kind of place intimacy, and can we translate it? Can we render it legible for other viewers, for other readers? Some people have the extraordinary ability to, to do this in a tremendously evocative way in writing. And I would, Keith's wisdom sits in places, and Katie Stewart's Space on the Side of the Road are just, extraordinary, books that I love to go back and reread because as literary adventures, they just really transport me. For people like me who like to hear and see the world and touch it in a different kind of way, it's, more and more making films and making sound recordings and circulating those things along with texts that works much better.
Thank you. That was lovely. And I think that's a lovely place to stop. So I would like to send out a huge thank you to everyone who joined us, to everyone who donated to support this event, to the panelists, thank you all so much, and to everyone at SAR who made this event possible. I want to remind you that this talk kicks off our Senses of Place Summer Series, and we have 3 more events planned. One on aesthetics and meaning in the Andes, June 17th, 2 p.m. One on space and place at Chaco Canyon, June 30th at 2 p.m. And finally, showing our strength, resilience, and compassion in the Indigenous Southwest, July 8th at 2 p.m. You can find more information at sarweb.org. You can click on the calendar or join us online. And speaking of joining us online, we have a new virtual membership that brings you into the SAR community for only $25 a year. And we'll put a link about that in the chat. So thank you again so much, and we will see you next time. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Kristina and Amal. It's really been a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, likewise.
If you can still hear me, I just want to say, Amal and Kristina, you really rock. I love your work, and thank you so much for being part of this with me.
Oh, so fun and great to, I obviously always love coming back to your work and engaging with your work. And also Kristina, such one of the pleasures of the last few years to be able to learn more about your work.
Yeah, thank you. Likewise, Steve. It was really wonderful to have the chance to meet you at Penn, and I really enjoyed the first event that we were involved in together. So I was really honored and thrilled to be able to join you today. And Amal, like I said, likewise, I definitely you're an instant ally in academia that I and I definitely genuinely appreciate and admire your work so much. So
Thank you.
It's really wonderful.
Steve also an instant ally, so there we are.
Alliance building. Yeah. Anyways.
Yeah. Solidarity. Thank you.
See you all soon.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Be well, everyone. Take care. Thank
Bye.
you.
Yep. Bye-bye.